Hello everyone, and welcome to this next lesson in sculpting the human head using Zbrush and Dynamesh. We're just going to continue on where we left off in the last lesson, and we're just going to continue refining the forms and just moving along in that fashion. So on my other monitor I have the reference images. Okay, and there's a link in the description where you can download these for yourselves as well. We're probably not going to stick to this guy exactly, but it's just kind of like a guideline. So feel free to kind of change it up and you know, make your own character as you see fit. Okay, so I'm just gonna I've already picked my model from my Lightbox menu, and that's just the same one that we finished off in the last lesson. And I'm just going to click and drag it on and go into edit mode by pressing T. Okay, and now I can edit the object. I'm also going to go into my document and put the range down and just click and drag and pick a color. I'm going to pick this mid-gray just to change the background, make it flat. And I'm going to change the material, click on the material, and pick matte cap gray. Okay. One final thing, just go into the render palette and preview shadows, and I'm going to take deep shadows off. All these things aren't mandatory, it's just how I like to set it up for myself. So whatever you feel is a comfortable environment for you to work in is what you should be using for yourself. Okay, so I haven't looked at this guy since the last time, and I think it's been a few days. So I'm just going to go around, take a look at him, see what's going on, see what needs to be changed. And it looks to me like this area seems a little flat. So there's a couple of ways we can fix that. Let's see. Let's maybe use the inflate brush for a change. Let's press B, I for inflate, and N. Okay, and let's just go over here. I'm going to use a fairly large draw size and just lightly whoops. It seems like my recording software is sometimes making my ZBrush go a little bit slower, so I apologize for that. It's an old computer. I am going to upgrade eventually, but she's pretty old, so bear with me. Okay, so if you look at the face here, I think that was a pretty good improvement, you know, but there's some flatness going on, there's some flat areas, and if you look at yourself in the mirror, or if you're looking at reference images, you know, you'll notice you don't really have a lot of really flat spots on a human head, or you know, it's a lot of these areas here, especially like the cheeks, are quite fleshy. You know, normally you'd have a flattened out area where there's not a lot of skin tissue and right against the bone, like maybe, but it's never really flat because you always have a subcutaneous fat or you know, skin tissue over the area. So again, like I said in the last lesson, I always like to pretend, you know, in my own mind, that you know, these characters have a soul, and you almost want to think of the soul pushing outwards of the forms. So this kind of gives a life to them, right? So anything that flattens the character out, it's almost like it's flattening the soul of the character. And I'm using soul as just a way to illustrate the inner forces. I don't actually mean like an actual soul, but it's just my way of interpreting the inner forces that tend to push out, you know, of a figure, and give it life. So already you know, this looks a little bit more natural. And I haven't touched the intensity or anything like that. I'm just using the inflate. I'm just pressing pretty light. I have a fairly large brush size. You know, you always want to use the largest brush you can for what you are doing. Because if you were to use a really small brush and you try to inflate, you know, you're gonna get this kind of weird bumpiness going on. It doesn't really look. I mean, this is actually a pretty neat effect if you want to add little details to muscles. You know, like maybe where the striations are. You know, that does work, but we're not there yet. And right now we're working on the larger form, so you really want to keep your brush size fairly large, so that you can impact more of the surface and and not have that bumpiness. So I'm just gonna smooth that a little bit. So that's one occasion where I'll use a smooth brush. You know, if I find that it's kind of getting bumpy, I'll just give it a quick smooth. But I try to avoid it. I'm not a big smooth brush guy. Nothing wrong with it. It's just me personally. I don't like smoothing too much. I kind of like the surface to be a little bit rough. So there's some weirdness going on here, and I guess I overinflated the mouth area, or this transition here. See, it's not that noticeable. This is why it's really important to look from different angles, but it's not that noticeable on this side. But if you look over here, you can really tell. Actually, let's look at this way. And I'm just going to bring my image over here. And if we zoom in, let me zoom out a little bit. You can tell that, you know, there's not that much displacement in a real face, you know, as opposed to what I did over here. Whoa. Let's see if I can show you. Oh, where'd it go? There we go. It's giving me a hard time. Okay, so if you look over here, there's a bit too much displacement compared to up here. It's a little bit more subtle. But that's kind of the process. You always want to exaggerate a little bit, because then you can just take it down, right? You kind of always want to go a little bit further you always want to go a little bit further with the form and then bring it down afterwards. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it down, and I'm also noticing here that there's a divot, and this should be out more. Maybe the eye needs to be pushed out a little bit more. The brow's a little flat. And so looking at your reference material really does help to kind of what's the word I'm looking for, but kind of not debug, but kind of understand and deconstruct what's going on that is not working, you know. So obviously this needs to come down. The chin probably could use a little bit of inflation. The nose is so-so. It looks like it might be a little short. But again, I'm not copying exactly, so I'm not really worried about that too much. But obviously the brows could use a little bit more inflation as well. But this is the major problem right here. It's just, and we're talking subtleties. I mean, this is probably maybe 3 or 4 millimeters. So when you're dealing with a face, it's like you're never, when we're at this point anyway, we're at the secondary form, so at this point you're only going to really be worrying about minute, you know, like millimeters here and there. It's never a big change. So let's go back. I'm just going to dock this to my other window. And so let's make some changes here. Now I could even put that image on a plane and use that way, or use you know, Spotlight. But I kind of prefer just having it on my monitor because I don't really need to. I really don't need it to be in the same window. I'm just going by eye. I'm not copying exactly. I mean, if it had to be exact, then maybe I would do it that way, but I just want to interpret it a little bit. So I'm going to actually use the Trim Dynamic brush for this, because the Trim Dynamic is perfect for taking down, you know, taking forms down little by little. So let's go in B, T, and D, and that's going to activate the Trim Dynamic, and I'm just going to brush a little bit. Now what I could do is just go into the view that I'm interested in looking at, and because I have X symmetry on, I can just work on this side, on the other side over here, but then keep an eye out on the forms on that side, and that way I don't have to keep on rotating the model, and then I can just look at my model on the other side over there, sorry, my reference images on my other monitor, and see if I'm getting the angle right. You could even use the Move tool, but again, the Move tool I find tends to, it's kind of weird sometimes when you push forms like this, it tends to flatten them out a little bit too much. Even though this Trim Dynamic is flattening out the forms, I find it flattens it out in a more natural way. I'm going to bring this down a little bit, maybe bring the draw size a little bit lower. Again, always using the biggest draw size you can for the surface you're working on. So it's going to be all relative to the surface, right? So if the surface is smaller, you're going to have to lower it, but you always want to use a bigger draw size that you can, as opposed to using a smaller one. You don't want to be doing this, for instance. You don't want to be going in with a really small draw size, because that's going to create a whole bunch of little, it just doesn't really work very well, unless you're trying to create a effect, like when you're doing detail work. But again, right now we're just roughing in the forms, so you kind of want to stay away from minute things. You want to be big and bold and confident, you know, confident in your strokes, which I know can be difficult when you're first starting out. So confidence just comes with practice, and you know, when you're learning. Actually, on any project, you should never be afraid of screwing up, especially when you're working digital, because you can always go back. I mean, that's the kind of the beauty of digital work, is that, you know, there's really never, you know, you can always go back. It's never like you destroy your whole piece, especially with ZBrush. So let's just press 9 to save it. Speaking of destroying your work, you should always save quite often. And now just by pressing Quick Save up here, or by pressing 9, ZBrush will automatically save iterations of your work. So it's not overwriting it, it's actually just saving a new file. And it saves up to 10, and then it'll start overwriting them again. And you can change that in the preferences, but I think 10 is fine. So that's probably looking a little better. Let's just bring in the reference image, and I think that's pretty close. This could probably go in that way more. Probably go that way in a little bit. It's protruding a little bit too much, and the angle of this fold here could go down a bit. Maybe the eye a little bit. There's still, I didn't fix that part yet, so let's go back here. And maybe let's do that. Let's use the clay buildup B, C, B. And no, I don't need to do that. But if you notice, I might jump around a little bit with brushes. I don't really stick to one, and that's just me. But I kind of like, you know, I find I could do this with the inflate, but sometimes I just like changing it up a little bit. I might change. I'm just using the Alt right now, so I'm taking away or displacing in the negative the material. And so just a little bit of cross-hatching, again still in the negative, still with the Alt pressed, using the clay buildup. And let me add some forms here, so we still haven't resolved those. And sometimes, even though the form is going this way, if you go a different direction or the opposite direction, I find sometimes that helps to define the form. there's no real set rule in any of this, so it's just kind of sometimes how I try to problem solve areas. You know, I'll try different things, and sometimes I'll have to erase them. Sometimes I'll work on a surface and you know, I just don't get what's going on, and I don't understand what's wrong, and I'll just keep on doing something, and I'll change it up until I get what I want. But you know, it does sometimes involve going over something, erasing it, going over, you know, undoing. You know, you have the with Control Z and undo button. It's like, you know, don't be afraid to experiment. That's what's great about ZBrush is. Or any digital program with the Control Z, just the undo function allows you to experiment and try different approaches, because sometimes you'll get stuck. I mean, I still get stuck. Everybody gets stuck, I think. So, you know, sometimes I don't understand why the lips aren't looking right, or you know, there's certain areas of the face that I can't understand what's wrong with it, and I'll try different things, and eventually you end up with a solution. I think I'm going to inflate this a little bit. I'm just using clay buildup, and I'm actually pressing pretty lightly and just trying to make it. I'm not really pressing that much on my tablet, kind of like a light pressure. Just defining things. So if you noticed, I kept the loose sketch marks all over this piece, and I really like that. Actually, let's use the Damien standard, BDS, and let's try to bring the lines of these folds, let's mark them down a bit. I think that's pretty good. Okay. So these could go down a little bit. BCB for clay buildup. And let's just go into the Alt. I could be using clay tubes again if I want to, but I'm not going to bother. If you remember in a previous lesson, I had used the clay tubes, and I took down the intensity to 15, and that works really well. It's similar to the clay buildup, but a little bit more subtle. But I'm feeling the clay buildup right now, so I think I'm just going to stick to that. And sometimes that's what it's like. I just kind of have a good vibe with a certain brush, and I'll just keep using it. Like I said, you know, you're going to find your own brushes. You might make your own. You're going to find that you're going to have your own preferences, and you have to figure out what works for you, and that just comes with working at it, just doing it, just practicing and seeing what works best, trying different brushes. It took me a while to figure out my workflow, actually, because I wasn't familiar with any of the brushes or anything like that, and I was coming from a traditional background, so I really didn't. A lot of the time I was trying to mimic what I was doing in real life, which does work to an extent, because ZBrush is pretty much analogous of doing you know, real life sculpting in clay or wax or what have you. But it probably has, in a lot of cases, even better methodologies than you would have available to you in traditional means. So, like the move tool, for instance, is a great feature, because if you try to, you can't do that in clay. I mean, there's no way you could just take clay and manipulate it like that easily. I mean, sometimes I've done projects where I've had a sculpture for a toy prototype, and you know, like the eyes, maybe I hadn't noticed I had made the eyes a little bit too close together or too far apart. And I mean, you're talking like days trying to resculpt that area and make it look right, because as I mentioned before, you know, when you change one thing on a sculpt, especially when you're dealing with the face, if you change certain features, so for instance, if the eyes were wrong and I move them apart, then it throws everything else off. And so I would have to resculpt the eyes, and then I have to resculpt the face, and you basically end up resculpting the whole head from scratch almost. So when you're dealing with digital, and especially with ZBrush, you know, all you're doing is, you can do that very quickly. You can just manipulate, let's go into the Move tool, BMV. You know, can easily manipulate. No, that doesn't look right. You can easily manipulate, you know, a character, and you don't have to worry about, you know, resculpting or doing anything like that. Actually, I kind of like this. Yeah, maybe I'll keep that. He's a little too angry though. A little bit more neutral. Kind of like the wider mouth though. Yeah, maybe I'll keep that. Why not? That's the thing though. That's the cool thing is like already, just by making those manipulations, you kind of make the character look different, you know, and you can try things. Like let's say, I think I mentioned this before too, but let's go out of symmetry, and let's say I want to try maybe some scars, BDS or something. You know, maybe I want to get an understanding of this character, and I'm just gonna maybe create a scar over his face or something, and you know, whatever. You know, now I have a whole different outlook towards this character, and you know, I can kind of get a sense of where to go with it. And you know, maybe I want to give him an eye patch or something on that side, or a fake eye or something. You know, actually that's kind of looking pretty cool. But it's too early for that because let's undo that. You know, you wanna make sure the proportions of the face are down before you start doing that stuff. That's more of a tertiary thing, and you know, you want to keep your symmetry on. I just put symmetry back on by pressing X. So you want to have your symmetry back on until you've resolved everything. And eventually we're gonna get out of symmetry because you know, as I mentioned before, like symmetry does not look natural. Okay, so looking like his ear's a little big. So let's see here. So the ears should line up like this, right across. Let's actually use transpose to illustrate. So I'm just going to drag out a transpose line. Let's get out of perspective as well. So obviously my ears are in the wrong position, okay, because they should line up with the top brow, and then roughly with the nose here. So it's probably just a matter of they're a little big. So let's go, I'm going to press Q and go back to draw mode, and what I'm going to do is just mask out this area. I'm just pressing Control and just basically painting on a mask. Okay. Now let's, with Control held down, I'm just going to tap the canvas, and as you can see, it inverted the mask. So now I can manipulate this, and I'm going to use the transpose tool. So I'm going to press E and drag out a line, hold down Shift to make it snap, and I'm gonna use the inner circle, red circle over here, and I'm just gonna drag that down a bit. That probably looks about right. Let's see here. So let's see. The bottom seems to line up, so maybe I should drag this down a bit. Let's use the Move tool. Maybe drag it down. I'm going to hold Shift to keep it in line with my transpose line. And let's just drag this here. Okay, let's go into the Move tool, BMV. I'm going to get a pretty big draw size. And let's just... It's pretty close. Let's go in a little closer here. So W, just transpose line. Transpose line probably should be around here. Okay, so that's pretty close, and it looks a little small to me. Let's drag this out. Oops. Control Z. Let's go into W for move. Let's move these out a little. Now, I'm not worried about the stretching that I'm getting. If you look at this, you know, it's stretching quite a bit. So I'm going to have to Dynamesh before I really am able to manipulate it. And so I can't really Dynamesh right now because I have the mask on. And so I'd have to clear my mask first. So I'm just going to try to manipulate as much as possible. Let's just go into draw mode before before I can do Dynamesh again. So let me just manipulate this as much as possible. Doesn't have to be perfect, but as close as possible. Now I'm noticing here, I think I have to bring this back a little bit, maybe this part here out. So some things I'm noticing. Okay, so now let's look at this. Now you're going to notice lots of stretching, and I'm just going to Dynamesh. Boom. Look at that. That's a really good illustration of what Dynamesh does. Okay, let's smooth this a little bit just to iron it out. I use the smooth tool mostly, as I mentioned before, just to iron out any pinched areas. Okay, so let's go into the clay buildup, B, C, B, clay buildup, and Alt, and I'm just going to cut into the surface. Just make some cuts. That's it. And when I was cutting in, I was using more pressure, and now when I'm trying to smooth it, I'm still using the clay buildup with the Alt. I'm using a lot less pressure. I'm just very lightly. Now it depends on your tablet. I'm using an Intuos 5, and it has really good tablet pressure sensitivity. I think it has a 1024 resolutions of touch sensitivity. If you're using a lower end model like a Bamboo, I think it has 514 or something like that. So it has about half. Still though, for the longest time I had used you know, a Bamboo style Wacom tablet, so it worked fine. So you don't have to use a more expensive one. I mean, you will notice it might not have as much resolution, but it still works quite well. So some funkiness going on here. Let's go into Move Tool, BMV, and let's just manipulate this ear a bit. Let's maybe bring this out a little, bring this back here. A little bit of bring this nose down a bit, maybe. And let's bring. Now, if you notice that when I use the Move tool, it tends to kind of manipulate. Even though I'm using a large draw size, it still kind of flattens it out. See what I mean? So that's what I was saying before. You kind of got to watch that. I mean, it's no big deal. You just go in and fix it, but don't expect that to use the Move tool and then not have to adjust it, because it just kind of moves things in a funny way sometimes. Okay, let's go clay buildup, BCB. There we go. Using a large brush, I'm just gonna cross hatch that area and just fix it up a little bit. Maybe it needs a little bit more protrusion here. I wonder if I should move those eyes out a little. Let's go to N. Let's go to a side view, and I'm going to go at a perspective, press W, drag out my transpose line, and just bring that out a little. That probably looks better. It's kind of looking mean, but kind of like that. Just adjusting the eyes a little bit. So, as I mentioned, the side of your pupil should actually coincide roughly with the corner of your mouth. So actually that looks pretty damn good. So I could probably open up the eyes a little bit though. It seems like, let's go into Damien Standard, BDS. And let's just go a little bit smaller draw. Oops. So make sure you're in the right subtool. So I press N, and I'm going to go click on my head, or I could have just pressed Alt and clicked on that. So here, a little bit of a divot. It shouldn't be. BCB for clay buildup. Let's add some material here. I mean, we're not really adding material, it's more like displacing it, but I kind of, visually it looks like you're adding, so that's why I say that, kind of like you're adding clay. That's not technically correct. some more cross-hatching. Just kind of got a Frankenstein thing going on here, so let's bring this down a little bit. Now I'm hoping you don't find these videos too boring. You know, this is kind of what I'm showing, everything real time, so this is what I go through. But I'm hoping that watching it is not too boring. I don't think you get, whoa, not a little bit too much. Let's undo some of these. And I'm just pressing Control Z. I could easily scrub through. I don't know, there's some weirdness going on here. I think maybe his cranium is a little high too. Let's use the inflate. B-I-N. Let's inflate this a bit. Yes. It's just telling me that it's not my last undo history, so. It kind of looks like Brainiac or something. I think his cranium is way too big. Let's go in trim dynamic, BTD, and let's use a larger draw size, and let's try to trim this. I'm using a light pressure, and I'm going to try to trim this. So with these videos, I'm showing you all the mistakes I make and how I correct them, which is really the most important part, because you're never going to do things perfectly. Oh, you might. You know, who am I to say, actually? I don't do things perfectly right away, I'll tell you that much. A lot of trial and error. That's just my workflow. There's probably people that are a lot better at this than I am in terms of getting forms down right away, but this is how I do it. I think it's the end result that counts, I hope. Yeah, there's some weirdness going on here. I can't really figure it out. Still using the trim dynamic, just going over it. There's obviously this is too far in. Should be rounder, so let's use the inflate, B-I-N. And I'm keeping my model farther on the canvas, so it's a little bit smaller, and I can manipulate it. I can make larger manipulations that way. I'm using light pressure. Whoops, let's go. So if you ever find that maybe you come in too close, what you can do, and you find maybe, let's go here. If you find maybe, I zoomed in too close, and now how am I, how do I rotate this model? Well, one thing you can do is that on the outskirts of the canvas is actually a dead zone, and you can use this to manipulate your object. So, I'm sorry, you can use it to do rotations or zooming in, zooming out, things like that. Grabbing. Or, if I'm, you can also press F, and that'll frame your model. So maybe if it goes over there, you can press F, and it'll just bring it back into the center. If you press F again, sometimes it'll give you an alternate frame mode. It'll frame it in a different way, but that depends. So for instance, if I, let's pick on a subtool. For instance, if I want to, now it's going to frame the eyes, right? But if I want to see the whole figure, I'll just press F again and it'll frame the whole thing. Okay, so I just pressed N and I'm back into the, back with the male head here. And this could probably go down a bit. And I could try using the move brush, BMV. Let's go back a bit. I'm going to really make a big draw size. And I was just using my scroll wheel on my tablet, but you can easily use S and do it that way. That's just S keyboard shortcut, or you can go up here, the draw size. Yeah, that looks a little better. There, now it's looking a little bit more natural. Just press 9, save that. So from the side view, and I'm not in perspective, okay, I was out of perspective, I was in orthographic just to make sure I don't have any distortion. Probably bring his Adam's apple out a little bit. Bring the chin up. Sorry, not the chin, the jawline. Oops. So from this view, I'm just looking at the silhouette. I'm just trying to determine the proportions overall. I think it's looking better now. Let's undo that. He kind of looks like RoboCop. The old one. The original, I mean. Kind of looks like Alex Murphy. Kind of funny. I'm just making some manipulations. Just to figure this, try some things. Something's quite not working for me, so. And like I said, this is going to happen to you too. Kind of just staring at something for a while, and well, sometimes it's just good to walk away. And you can just try things and see what works and what doesn't. You always undo. So just remember though that when you do manipulate from one view, you want to double check the other views. I find that the 3/4 view gives you a lot of information. And I'm just looking at my reference, I think. This might be out. It might be out a bit. Zoom in a bit so you can see what I'm doing. I don't usually zoom in too much when I'm doing manipulations like that because I'm looking at the silhouette from afar. I find it a little bit easier to understand the form as if I, as opposed to being this close. I will go closer if I have to do like smaller manipulations like here. But usually I want to make sure that the overall form is pretty good before I go in and manipulate the smaller ones. I guess nostrils might have to come down. And yeah, so this is kind of what it's like, just trial and error. Do something, destroy it, and redo it. That's my workflow anyway, let's put it that way. Probably not the most efficient, but that's kind of how I do things. So he's looking a little skeletal. Let's see here, this probably could go a little bit wider. Now, I don't really care right now that he does look a little bit, you know, gaunt and skeletal, but because that's easy to fix. So I'm going to actually, if you remember from last lesson, I'm going to Control Shift, drag, and I'm going to press Alt, and I'm going to hide those polygons. And that way I can see this view a little bit better. I kind of like this view actually, it looks pretty good. I'm just going to... There's a certain hierarchy to forms when you're looking at it from this view. So you never have, your mouth is never flat. Like it's never like this. Right? Your mouth never looks like that. So if you're having problems, and I see this a lot actually on with beginners, is they don't understand the mouth form properly, and it's something I struggled with as well when I was learning to sculpt, and it took me a while to really get the hang of it. But you know, it looks okay from the side view. It doesn't really look that great from the front, and a lot of the time they don't understand, you know, why is it not working. And one thing to look at is the bottom view. Okay, so these corners need to come down. You have almost like this truncated triangle shape, or like a truncated pyramid going on here. Let's undo that. There. So you want to recess the corners of the mouth. Okay, they don't protrude out. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, I was in orthographics, so it's even more visible with perspective. So you kind of have a cylindrical aspect to a face. You know, it has these curves, right? It has these curves all around. It's not flat. You know, so that's something to keep in mind. I like to look at the bottom view often, because it really gives me a sense of where my planes are in relation to each other. So let's maybe see what's going on. Just going to grab my reference image here, and let's see. So the corners of the mouth probably could go down a bit. This is still a little bit too puffy, although maybe it's just my... See, there's some material missing here because this line, whoops, this line is continuous, whereas here there's this divot, so it's not as continuous. Now again, I don't have to copy this exactly or anything, but this is a good reference to go with. And this curve here is not present here. It's kind of flattened. This needs to be opened up a little bit more. It's too kind of Neanderthalish. I need to maybe raise nostrils a little bit. Not the nostrils, but the actual tip of the nose here. Let me bring this down a little bit. Okay, so let's see here. Let's use the trim dynamic, BTD. And let's go a little bit smaller with the draw size. You see I was manipulating that a little bit. I can always mask it out. Just making adjustments based on my perception. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Let's take off his mask. It looks like he's wearing makeup. Just trimming this down, try to make it a little bit of more of a uniform surface. And so I'm still looking at my reference image on the other monitor. I think that should go down a little bit. Still using trim dynamic, and I think I need to fill in a little bit of this. Let's go into let's use clay tubes this time. B, C, T, and I'm going to take this down to about maybe 17. That's the Z intensity. Press enter. And let's just fill this in. It's a little bit more subtle than using clay buildup. So for you traditional sculptors out there, it's almost like I'm using a finer rake tool to, or a finer rake tool to resurface the area. See, it kind of, when you compare it to the clay buildup, it's actually smoothing it out a little bit more. You still have the nice tool marks, but it doesn't have the harsh tool marks, mostly because the intensity is really low. There's not that much difference between the clay tubes and the clay buildup, but there is a slight difference to it, and I haven't really put my finger on what that is, but I do notice it. And so I find that one brush lends itself better for certain things than the other, and so I'll use them in different situations. Maybe dig this out a little bit. Now, obviously, those marks I had made, I just lost. So let's go into the Damien standard, BDS, and that's what happens. You know, you're gonna create marks, and then you're gonna lose them, and you just basically redraw them in. Let's just smooth that a little bit. Okay, let's just hit 9, and let's re-Dynamesh. Control drag. Oops. So it's telling me that my mesh must be totally visible. So let's go Control Shift Tap. And that brings out my mesh, my whole mesh that was hidden, and I'm just going to control drag. Boom. Didn't look like anything happened, but it did. And here's a neat trick I'll show you. I'm going to use a pinch brush, and B, P, and I for pinch, and I want to bring these lines a little closer together. I'll just go on it. Make them a little bit closer, maybe in the corners of the mouth. The pinch brush basically does exactly as it sounds. It brings forms, pinches them together. It's kind of, I use it for like the corners of mouths, or when I want to bring forms together. Like if I was doing a scar, for instance, it's actually a pretty good example. I'm going to go out of symmetry, Damien standard, BDS. And say I want to do a scar like before, and you know, whatever. Whoops. ZBrush will do that sometimes. Just kind of, whoo. Okay, so I have a scar here, and if I use a pinch brush, BPI, I can make it look a little bit more realistic, because that's what happens with your skin. It'll start to pinch around these areas that have scarred, because the scar tissue is a little bit tougher. And from there you could actually use inflate, B-I-N, and just inflate the edges maybe a little bit. Now this is really rough. I mean, this is not something I would be doing at this stage. You know, this is more detail work, but just to give you an idea of how you can use a pinch brush, that's pretty cool. So it kind of brings shapes together. Let's just undo that. Don't. Let's go back to where. Whoops. There. Let's just control drag. There. Let's go back into the X. Actually, it's control drag again. So Dynamesh, if you're not in symmetry mode, it's gonna Dynamesh asymmetrically. So if you want symmetrical Dynamesh, you should be in symmetry mode. It's just something to keep in mind. Just using the inflate brush just to bring out the forms a little bit. And yeah, just looking around. So it looks like to me that those nostrils are probably too far apart, and same with this area here. So it's BMV for move brush, and I'm going to make the size bigger. Whoops, make sure you're grabbing the right thing, and you can adjust the draw size according to what you want to grab. Maybe this area should be a little bit inflated more. I'm going to grab the tip of the nose. Using a smaller draw size, I can manipulate shapes that are in smaller details. So, but I'm still kind of keeping the camera view farther away, so I can get a whole overall sense of the figure. You know, sometimes I'll try things and go over them and go over them and go over them, and that's what takes me a while sometimes, but you know, who cares? It's for my own project, so I don't have a time. I don't have a deadline really, so I don't really care. It's fun, you know. I don't want to have that kind of pressure either. I just want to have fun. You know, if it was for somebody else's project, I probably would already have something I'd be going by anyway, so I'd probably have reference images, concept art that I'd be going by, and it'd be a lot quicker to just kind of check with that. But when you're creating your own stuff, like, you know, who cares how fast you do it, really? It's just, you're going to get faster naturally just by doing it and practicing. So, you know, that just comes with time and experience. I'm a lot faster than I was a year ago. I should show you some of my older, my ZBrush sculpts from a year ago. Even though I knew how to sculpt traditionally, I couldn't do the same quality as I could traditionally as I could in ZBrush at first, because it was kind of like learning a new material. But eventually, if you can get over the initial hurdles and frustrations, then you know you can do anything. That's with anything though. Like, I'm learning the Unity engine right now and that whole process, and you know, right now it's a little frustrating, but you know, you just keep at it. There's no secret. You know, there's no magic formula. It's like you just have to redo and keep doing and practice and practice and practice, you know. I know it sounds pretty cliche, but that's exactly pretty much it. There's no shortcut, there's no secret formula. You know, that's what these guys do that you see that are doing amazing art, is they just work at it all the time, and they continuously improve. And you know, you always try to improve your workflow, you always try to improve your learning, you're always learning, you're always studying, and that's how you improve, really. Okay, so I've managed to talk for about an hour again, and you know, hopefully you guys are still with me and have not fallen asleep. But I think I'm going to stop the video here, and let's just quick save that. And yeah, we're going to continue on the next lesson from here. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and you know, again, if you like my video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe, because I update my lessons on a weekly basis. Okay, so give it a shot at on your own characters, and I will see you in the next video.